fantastic morning and kickoff to our conference, exploring the many themes around continuity and commerce, property rights, pursuit of happiness, the tensions therein, and we have much yet to learn this afternoon. It's my job to introduce our lunch keynote speaker, and I'll do that in just a moment. But before I do that, I would like to tell our audience just a little bit about the Coolidge Foundation, because it occurs to me that many may be joining us for the first time. The Coolidge Foundation was founded in 1960 by President Coolidge's son, John Coolidge. We are a private alternative to what are otherwise federally funded, mostly presidential libraries. Coolidge is, in fact, the last president not to have a federally funded library, a fact that he would smile upon, we're certain. He thought that the wage earner ought to keep as much of his and her wages as possible rather than handing them over in taxes. That, of course, does mean that we must raise all of our money, and so we're very grateful again to our sponsors and all of our supporters who make these programs possible. The Coolidge Foundation is headquartered in Plymouth Notch, Vermont, where Calvin Coolidge was born and where he now lays to rest. Every year we bring many hundreds of students to his homestead to learn the Coolidge legacy, the story, and the values that he came to know growing up there. We run many programs, this conference, of course, being key among them, which brings together our many audiences. I see people scribbling notes, which is fantastic. I hope you'll continue doing it. Please also know that a forthcoming edition of our periodical, the Coolidge Review, will encapsulate the proceedings of this conference with many papers which will be turned into articles. That goes out to a few thousand people, including all of the alumni of our programs. Now, I just want to say another word or two about the alumni who are here. We have the Coolidge Scholarship, and people often say, well, how do you get scale? If there are so many young people around the country who don't get a proper education in Coolidge or founding principles, how can you reach them? And our vehicle, by and large, is the Coolidge Scholarship. It's a full ride, 4-year merit scholarship to any college in America. We just closed the application period for our 10th class, we're proud to say, and had a record number of applications, 4,910. Thank you. This year we've made a theme, not just at this conference, but through all our programming, to focus on the Declaration. And so those 4,910 students wrote an essay on Coolidge's speech, the inspiration of the Declaration. And they wrote a second essay. This isn't an easy application, mind you. They wrote a second essay on Coolidge's tax policy as well. From that, we have a few winners every year, and a few of them are joining us, and a larger group of Coolidge senators. The top 100 applicants are named Coolidge senators and come and spend time with us in Plymouth to learn about Coolidge and hear from speakers, including many of the speakers who are joining us today. Travel up to the Notch, as we call it, in the summer to brief them further. The senators then come back and participate in programs like this to build a broad national community of young people committed to learning about history and learning about the principles that Coolidge thought were important. And our other major student program is the Coolidge Speech and Debate Program, and we're honored to be joined today by many members of our Honors Society, the 1890 Society. Coolidge gave his first big speech in 1890 when he spoke to his graduating class at Black River Academy of Ludlow, Vermont, maybe a dozen or fewer people, but he thought it was awfully important, and he spoke about the importance of rhetoric in history. And the 1890 Society is here with us. Our debate program is promoting free speech, diversity of ideas, civil exchange, which we think are so key to a good citizenship, as we try to enlarge the Whigs or the Coolidges all around the country. So welcome to the debaters as well. I should just mention, too, on your tables is our latest foundation report, and you can learn more about all these efforts right in there. Without further ado, at lunch today, we've heard a lot of theory and principle and what Coolidge thought about it, and now we'll hear how Coolidge actually applied the principles in the way that he led. And to do that, we have no better speaker than Coolidge's biographer and the inspiration of our work here at the Coolidge Foundation, She needs no introduction, but I'll do it anyway. She said to keep it brief, but former member of the Wall Street Journal editorial board, author of numerous best-selling books on economic history. Many have gotten to know Amity Shlaes through her work on The Forgotten Man, New History of the Great Depression. She then worked backwards to write Coolidge, which I think it's fair to say is my favorite of those among all of them. To hear about Coolidge and the application of the principles of the Declaration, please welcome our chairman, Amity Shlaes.
Good day. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, trustees. Thank you, guests. There's a kind of euphoria around inauguration time. It's the euphoria that comes with the possibility of change. Even those who didn't vote for the man who won or the lady who won, feel that euphoria. Maybe it's just curiosity that they have about it. But in any case, things that seemed impossible a year before now seem possible. But of course, what's possible is only possible for a while. 3 years into a presidential term, the world narrows, the impossible starts to predominate, and possibility expires. A sense of the fragility of the possible preoccupied Calvin Coolidge at his own inauguration here in Washington a century ago, in 1925. In his own life, while a politician in Massachusetts and now in Washington, he had watched a new philosophy take hold and spread in American politics, the philosophy that the federal government should always do more and move faster. The government in this philosophy had license to impinge everywhere, since it was argued it could do better than any other force for humanity. And a sort of subset of that philosophy was that the parchments of the founders, anything old, was outdated in the rearview mirror as we speed forward. But Coolidge believed this philosophy, essentially progressivism, was not necessarily correct. And his election gave him a possibility of demonstrating that old principles such as government restraint and individual freedom could serve even a modern America of the 21st or 20th his century. The progressives, he knew, might win in 1928, the next election, or in 32. So his own time was short. And he determined not to squander a day, an hour, or a minute of it. Indeed, as he put it when he talked about his tax program, he would bend all his energies to proving the validity of old principles. You'll observe a tension here. Coolidge had to move fast to get American lawmakers to move more slowly, right? One way Coolidge bent his energy was through speeches. Fact, he wrote them nearly all himself. Fact, First Lady Grace Coolidge later said that work was the hardest the president did. He pored over his essays. Coolidge didn't write speeches, he agonized them until they were done. Why? Because he wanted to showcase the relevance of founders' principles before they were swept away for good. The greatest gift in this department, Janice Rogers Brown has spoken about, the inspiration of the Declaration, a speech he gave in 1926 to honor another anniversary, the 150th anniversary of the Declaration. That's the same document we're studying at this conference. There, Coolidge struck directly at the proposition that the Declaration was too old to matter, and against progressive activity or hyperactivity, the impulse to jettison all, update, and change. The Declaration would never be too old, Coolidge said, for it illuminated principles, as we saw this morning, that existed long before the founding, and it would still hold long after the founding. Here, religion plays a role. He quoted the theologian Thomas Hooker, who said First, the foundation of authority is laid in the free consent of the people, but that also that there was an older order deriving from God, not lawmakers, that ruled our lives. The choice of public magistrates belong unto the people. How? By God's allowance. The finest scholar on this speech is Janice, so we're very glad to have the judge here. And her thoughts will be in the forthcoming issue of the Coolidge Review. Coolidge also countered the argument that more law made by men or women was necessary to bring about social change. There was, as he put it in another speech, a limit to what law can do. He even titled the speech, "The Limitations of the Law," to underscore his point. But to the 26th speech, which we repeat quite often today, but never enough, listen to the words he chooses. Declaration anniversary. About the Declaration, there is a finality that is exceedingly restful. It is often asserted the world has made a great deal of progress since 1776, that we have had new thoughts and new experiences which have given us a great advance over the people of that day, and that we may therefore very well discard their conclusions for something more modern. That would be the AI of his generation. That is, any new invention that dizzied people with its possibility. But that reasoning cannot be applied to this great charter. If all men are created equal, that is final. If they are endowed with inalienable rights, Coolidge didn't say unalienable, as the framers did. He said inalienable, and that he modernized. Inalienable rights, that is final. If governments derive just powers from the consent of the governed, that is final. If progressives wanted to move beyond those principles, Coolidge suggested, they were wrong. No advance, no progress can be made beyond these propositions. Those who would change, and he was getting at the progressives, were in reality reactionary, just as we discussed this morning. Their ideas were not more modern, but more ancient than those of the Revolutionary Fathers. It was the job of government, therefore, to respect old laws, at least these, and to pull back, to restrain itself, to leave room for enterprise, and for what Coolidge defined as things of the spirit. In this work, Coolidge said, the government now in the 20s must be like-minded as the fathers. Elsewhere, he also referenced the despotism of a faraway power, the first topic of the Declaration. The potential despot he identified for his own era, however, was Washington, D.C., the federal government that had a tendency now to lord it over states and individuals. The founders had resisted the crown for imposing taxes without our consent. Now, 150 years later, the federal government could also exert dangerous powers over citizens. That it could, to quote the Declaration, threaten to eat out their substance, the substance of citizens. And here's the way Coolidge put it: as the activities of government increase, as it extends its field of operations, the initial tax which it requires becomes manifolded many times when it is finally paid by the ultimate consumer. When there is added to this aggravated financial condition an increasing amount of regulation and police control, the burden of it all becomes very great. Behind very many of these enlarging activities lies the untenable theory that there is some shortcut to perfection. Timing again. Such speeches got him a great nickname, the modern bridge to the founders. But it is not what Coolidge said, which we discuss all through this conference, but what he did that I'd like to focus on for just a couple minutes this lunch. He not only taught the Declaration, he sought to live the Declaration, and sometimes at personal cost. The president's main drive, you could call it a crusade actually, was to curtail the federal government's actions in that area where it threatened its despotism most clearly, which would be taxation. Recall that just about a decade before, a decade plus a couple years, the federal government had imposed no income tax. After the 16th Amendment, though, lawmakers at first set the rate at what they considered high. I defer to Congressman French Hill, but I think they did believe it was high, 7%. That was a high enough rate for the income tax. Yet in 5 years, the top rate hit 77% under statute. Why was that? 6 years, why was that? One reason is the human nature. When you get a new toy, and the income tax was a new toy, you want to play with it. And right away, this little idea, the income tax, it became clear that it was a powerful toy, a better revenue getter than the old toys, such as the tariff. So you play with your toy, right? Lawmakers enjoyed using it, seeing the money stream in. The second reason was the emergency of World War I. Now that the war was past, the emergency, Coolidge and indeed Harding before him wanted to ensure the tax would not enable peacetime despotism. Wilson and Harding, Woodrow Wilson and Warren Harding, cut taxes after World War I, but Coolidge and his ally at Treasury, Andrew Mellon, wanted to cut more. And 50%, which is about the level of the cut, was not acceptable to Coolidge. So I'll read you more of his language. The country needs every ounce of its energy to restore itself. The expenses of government reach everybody. I want the people of America to work less for the government and more for themselves. Having the reward of their own industry was, Coolidge said, the chief meaning of freedom. Cutting taxes after tax cuts, which is where we were, is not easy. The lawmakers on the Hill liked their toy. And the first tax cut Coolidge had done in 24, well, we only reduced rates somewhat. But now, at his inauguration, he was elected on his own. He was quite aggressive. He called over-taxation legalized larceny. Ooh, you're accusing your colleagues. He was determined. People often ask me why the Coolidges were so friendly with Alice Roosevelt Longworth, since she was the daughter of a politician with some different views about progressivism. Theodore Roosevelt. Well, one reason was the Coolidges liked Alice. She was clearly likable. But another reason was that Alice's husband, Congressman Nick Longworth, was becoming Speaker of the House even as Coolidge mounted his tax campaign. Actually, Congressman Hill has written about this. Longworth was the ally Coolidge, the administration, needed to get its next cut done. And they did. They pulled the top marginal rate down to 25%, which if you look at the charts, say in the Tax Foundation has them and the government has them too, is the lowest rate we've had since. President Reagan's rate was 28. But if you wanted to honor the framers, well, reducing tax burdens was not enough. He also insisted, he wasn't quite the modern supply-sider, on cutting the budget. Today we have the Doge. Harding had established his own Doge, the Bureau of the Budget, to monitor and limit spending of the federal government departments. What Harding established, this was Coolidge's toy. Coolidge deployed monitoring and cutting spending in every area of the executive branch. Reducing spending year over year over a period is nigh impossible. Then as now, the economy and the population were growing, yet here Coolidge recalled his boyhood on the farm, where every penny counted. He likened cutting the federal budget to cheese paring at the cheese factory. Some of our students have been to the cheese factory. His father founded that. I want to save money, he said, because I want to save people, not because I'm Scrooge. The result was, well, I'll just describe it. This was a deliberate campaign. The result, he balanced the budget every year and reduced it. The stupendous fact is that when he left the presidency, after 67 months, the federal government was smaller than when he took office. Other peacetime presidents have cut the budget year over year. Eisenhower comes to mind, but none, at least in peacetime, cut the budget repeatedly over half a decade. Yet another concern of the framers was regulation, the swarms of officers you heard about sent by the Crown to harass our people. Coolidge likewise worked hard to keep down officers, and in particular new offices of government. In at least one speech discussing the past, when Washington had been smaller, Coolidge actually played the language of the Declaration. He said no great swarms of public employees were necessary in the past. As president, he vetoed ag subsidy twice, agricultural subsidy, hard to do when you're from an agriculture state like Vermont. A new board that Congress wanted to create to oversee commodity prices, well, he termed that the widespread, he condemned or warned against the widespread bureaucracy it would set up, and he called it repugnant. Hydropower at the time, but I guess only at the time, seemed like the energy technology of the future. Coolidge vetoed what would become much later the mighty Tennessee Valley Authority. Any effort, of course, to pull back government was for individuals, was not just for show, let me say. Pulling back government mattered because what it left space for. Room for individuals to play and to flourish, freedom for commerce, and to allow American business to show what it could do for the average man. Business was not there to serve government, Coolidge said, it was the other way around. That doesn't mean he was a crony capitalist. He mostly wasn't. He thought, well, when business did something illegal, it ought to be prosecuted. But perpetual war on business, the theater of class warfare against business, was awful costly, he noticed. So he was different when it came, for example, to antitrust than the Taft administration or the Theodore Roosevelt administration. And he pointed out the chief business of the American people is business. Because of his hands-off approach, business was able to deliver. I know that Great Gatsby is taught in every high school, and it's a beautiful book, but it does not capture the 20s accurately. The proof of the reality of the 20s, they were no champagne bottle, no illusion, was the increase in standard of living. Nearly all Americans saw their lives improve in the 20s, including African Americans. Even the rate of lynching goes down, the worst crime goes down in the later 20s. People got automobiles, they got appliances, and they got indoor plumbing for the first time. Economists still speak with wonder of the gains in productivity. How do you explain what a productivity gain means to someone? Well, before the 20s, the rule was Americans work 6 days. The productivity gains meant they only had to work 5. So the best way to shortcut this story is to say the 20s productivity gave us a gift we prize. It's called Saturday. And what about the restful concept? Well, America had been in sort of perma-crisis coming out of World War I, very similar to now, and it became calmer. There was an era of good feeling. It became restful as a result of these decisions. Time presses. What can burnish your reputation now that you're almost done? Well, you can't squander political capital with a scandal, can you? That's what's wrong with scandal. It takes away political capital, which is always finite. So Coolidge knew he had to live more as servant, certainly, than king. He had to live like George Washington, without too much extravagance. If the nation was cutting its budget, well then the White House must cut its budget. This became rather rough. The White House housekeeper, Elizabeth Jaffray, was an institution all by herself. She had been around since the Tafts. She liked to go around in a buggy to the specialty shops, to Italy, so to speak, and pick out the nicest sauces. Well, this kind of bugged Coolidge. He thought she ought to buy in bulk at the Costco, so to speak, of the day. It was the Piggly Wiggly. And when Mrs. Jaffray showed him a spread of pork she had for dinner, maybe pork chops, and she was very proud, and all Coolidge said was, that looked like an awful lot of ham to him. Well, soon enough, Mrs. Jaffray was gone, replaced by Miss Riley from New England, and every expense now had to be written down. And in 1926, the books showed, the White House entertainment budget, President pays a good share of this, was $11,667. And in 1927, Miss Riley reported in her book that it was down to $9,116, and the president reviewed the notebook himself, if you can believe it, and wrote something in the margin, the highest praise from him. Very fine improvement, Miss Riley. What about Coolidge's other promises to more disadvantaged Americans, to African Americans? If all men are equal, that is final. In the 20s, all men were not equal. Coolidge was not like Lyndon Johnson, who responded to trouble with the phrase, you've heard it, the fierce urgency of now. Action, action, laws, laws, laws. But he was not like Woodrow Wilson either, as Chris Cox shows, and Chris Cox shows us what Wilson was like. Coolidge was no segregationist. He called for anti-lynching legislation every year in his message, and that must have been slightly a strain for him because he was also a Federalist, right? He called for legislation that told states what to do. Because, very, very interesting, because he saw that the wrong was so great. He also publicly dressed down fellow Republicans, and normally he never hurt other Republicans, who did not want to see African Americans run for office. That is, he believed in education, he believed in opportunity, he offered opportunity, and that progress would come with that, but he was more gradualist, as we said this morning, more incrementalist than America's been lately. Sticking to principle is painful. All of us have vanity. The issue is only how one suppresses it, isn't it? I think Coolidge did suppress his vanity, but he was often grumpy about it. It's hard. It's a lot of exertion, right? Once on a difficult way, Senator Selden Spencer, wanted to cheer up Coolidge, the grumpy, by taking him for a walk, the U.S. president. So he pointed to the White House. They're walking along. Pointed to the White House. Spencer asked, "What lucky dude gets to live in that house, the one with the pillars?" And Coolidge said, "Nobody. They just come and go." Nobody. His campaigns for the old principles forced him into real personal sacrifices. The most important days of the tax legislation fell in early 26, a time when his father lay dying in Vermont. Yet Coolidge could not travel to Plymouth to sit by his dad in the last hours. He arrived only for the funeral, and as he writes, and all the students here know this, he writes, it costs a great deal to be president. Another sacrifice came with the election of 28. Remember, Coolidge had been elected only once in 24. He certainly could run again. His own party counted on it. They needed his coattails to ride on. He was very popular. Yet I know that Coolidge replayed the founders. He chose not to run again. He wanted to be more like George Washington than like Theodore Roosevelt. A spoiler. And as he explained in his autobiography, again, he laid it out, the chances of having wise and faithful public service are increased by a change in the presidential office after a moderate length of time. Perhaps the greatest price to Coolidge came in the cost to his reputation. Because his ideas, and we can argue even his person, so conflicted with the progressive vision, progressives reviled him. Recently, our researcher, I think William and John Sullivan, found some comments on Coolidge from the great progressive justice, Louis Brandeis. Coolidge appointed a lot of judges as president, and Brandeis raged in private. The Coolidge debauch of the judiciary continues apace. all his judges. At a public event, Coolidge emphasized George Washington's practicality, his business side. Brandeis went incandescent with rage. As he wrote to Felix Frankfurter, his protege, later went on the bench, Coolidge wanted to confiscate the whole of GW's goodwill for big business. Brandeis saw Coolidge as a cog, a puppet of crony capitalism. So beside himself was Brandeis, who is normally a nice, judicious man, that he told Frankfurter that listening to Calvin Coolidge made him feel as he had when he'd visited a ward for people with syphilis. I kid you not, in a private letter in Boston, I had a like sense of uncleanliness. Well, what happened to Coolidge after the presidency? Coolidge knew and corresponded with William Howard Taft. William Howard Taft went on the Supreme Court after the presidency. The SCOTUS would have been a logical upgrade for Coolidge from simple retirement. He had the interest, he had the skill, yet no nomination came. And as you know, progressives did take Congress and the White House. Coolidge passed away just as Roosevelt was crafting plans for the Tennessee Valley Authority. He was not there in the 30s to comment on policy in the Depression. In that period, progressives did downgrade Coolidge, including blaming him for the Depression. If you ask me, did Coolidge cause the Depression, you can say the answer in one word, no. So he remains downgraded in our books to this day. There were a few at the time who understood this evaluation of Coolidge might be wrong. One was the Wall Street Journal, which commented in its 1933 obituary of Calvin Coolidge that in due time, the good fortune of the United States to have had such a man as Coolidge, in just the years he filled that office, the presidency will be more clearly recognized than it has been. But setting aside the man, even more important is the legacy, establishing the relevance of founding documents for today. And here, those documents are ready to define and shape our path forward. Uncertain as we are, we proceed in the knowledge of their strength. And that, as Coolidge would put it, feels exceedingly restful. Thank you.